In this news roundup of a week for 16th of December 2022, the EU is rocked to its core by a massive corruption scandal that its enemies believe could become a rout of the bureaucrats. China is seeing its hospitals rapidly overwhelmed as COVID takes off, but they're not reporting about how many are dying. And Vladimir Putin cancels all of his most important engagements, fueling speculation as to whether the end is in sight. And in this week's Short Thought, why you probably want fewer than 169 priorities for your New Year's resolutions. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. This week, the EU has been reeling from its worst corruption scandal in decades. Belgian police carried out raids against various figures, including European Parliament Vice President Eva Kaili, and recovered around €1.5 million in cash, believed to have been from Qatar, although that's denied by the Qatari government. Greek MEP Kaili was voted out of her vice president position by the parliament, removed from the Socialists and Democrats parliamentary grouping, although that was probably the least of her problems, as she is currently residing in jail. Her Italian boyfriend admitted to Brussels magistrates that he played a part in bribery while claiming that Kaili wasn't involved. The couple have a 22-month-old daughter. He was asking for her release so that she could look after her. Since the scheme seems to be focused on buying influence in the EU Parliament, that sounds unlikely to be persuasive, particularly since Kaili's father was caught red-handed carrying a briefcase filled with €650,000 in cash. This was what allowed police to waive the MEP's diplomatic immunity to search her home, which delivered yet more bags of cash and valuables. The Greek Anti-Money Laundering Authority is investigating a newly established real estate company by Kaili and her partner. Kaili was reported as having visited Qatar on November the 20th for the World Cup opening match, which she avoided drawing attention to with no photos posted to social media. Cypriot MEP Lucas Forlas said that he'd been approached by Kaili to make amendments to a European Parliament report on human rights in Qatar. The report was damning, and Kaili suggested amendments would have watered down the severity of the conclusions, which could all be an unfortunate coincidence, obviously, but shall we say that's not the leading theory. 10 offices were sealed off by the European Parliament Security Services, leading one shocked MEP to comment, "We are all standing in the middle of a crime scene, with offices sealed, colleagues in prison, confronted with the allegation that at least one of us has become a Trojan horse of corruption and foreign interference." As you can imagine, EU leaders are intensely embarrassed at the scandal, not least because some of those figures that have been pursued by Brussels for not meeting their standards on the rule of law are taking full advantage. Figures such as Viktor Orban, who can now quite legitimately say that EU heads have been presiding over massive corruption while lecturing them on how to run their countries. Poland leaders quickly took note of the fact that Eva Kaili had been one of the most vocal critics of their country's governance. One of the ruling party's MEPs, Dominik Tarczyński, said this: "The question arises, where is the problem with the rule of law? In Poland or in the European Union?" Roberta Metsola, the European Parliament's president, said that the Parliament was assailed by foreign actors that seek to undermine us. She promised that there would be no sweeping under the carpet. There are too many ways that decisions are taken that could be done better. Too many informal groupings that are potentially more amenable to influence. Too many organisations whose transparency of funding is not clear. Which sounds impressive until you ask, is this the first time you'd noticed that those things were happening on your watch? In the short term, MEPs agreed to block all work relating to Qatar until further notice and to establish an investigation into corruption by countries outside the EU. New plans would also bar MEPs from accepting donations from outside the bloc, and they would have to declare their assets at the beginning and also then at the end of their time in office to see how much they profited from their public service. All of that so suddenly, that's an indication of an institution that knows it's in serious trouble. The question will be whether this turns out to be a shocking aberration that forced the ratcheting up of a few standards, or whether this is the opening of a floodgate, and evidence of more and more corruption is now going to come to light, which could completely undermine the European project. Given the admission of inadequate systems, large numbers of informal gatherings and interested parties, it seems to stretch credibility that this one instance is as deep as the rabbit hole goes. Now, speaking of stretched credibility, that will aptly describe any and all COVID stats we get given about China over the coming couple of months. As expected, the relaxation of COVID policies in China has meant that COVID-19 has been letting rip, with clinics and hospitals reportedly quickly being overwhelmed. Now, that's not a surprise, because the proportion of critical care beds in China per population is extremely low. So this was always a point of significant vulnerability. Hospitals have been hurriedly increasing their fever ward capacity, but have been overwhelmed nonetheless. Indeed, the South China Morning Post shared video footage from outside one clinic where multiple people had been attached to a drip while still in their cars due to the clinics being completely full. And people in hospital for non-COVID reasons have reason for concern as well, since hospital workers who have been infected are being required to continue working. So hospitals have become places where you're highly likely to catch COVID if you didn't have it already. At the same time, there has been panic buying, which is probably the first time we've seen that as a result of lockdowns being relaxed rather than imposed. Principally, this affected any medicines that are popularly believed, rightly or wrongly, to have some impact on COVID, along with COVID testing kits. And it included lemons and tinned peaches, which have been the subject of rumours online that their high vitamin C and long shelf life means that they can relieve symptoms of COVID. Others rushed to buy electrolyte water after it was marketed as a tool for rehydration after sweating or a fever. The state news Global Times also reported that there were rumours circulating that drinking high quantities of alcohol would kill the virus. Well, if that had been true, binge-drinking Britain would have been well positioned to ride out the storm. But sadly not. The overall picture in a country where people don't trust the information given to them by the authorities is that many are reportedly blindly buying drugs, mixing medicines and taking more than necessary. Now, this is the more extreme Chinese form of fear overlap that we saw in the UK. Having had the government deliberately putting fear into everyone once it came time to relax restrictions, many were highly reluctant to return to normal because the fear stayed with them. Now, how much more here? Until just a couple of weeks ago, the Chinese government was saying the coronavirus was so bad they had to be locked down on sight, and that this was because their leaders wouldn't sacrifice them in the way that the callous West had done to their people. Now, literally overnight, they're being told, well, it's not so bad. One of the key government experts, Zhong Nanshan, said this week that Omicron should really be called coronavirus cold, because it had a similar fatality rate to seasonal flu. Now, their citizens will be thinking back to the deaths by fire of those people who were locked into their building in the name of zero COVID, the event that sparked the protest recently, and noticing that either someone is very wrong now, or they were really wrong then. In Beijing, the restaurants have opened up again, although they have almost no customers. The streets are reported to be extremely quiet. Companies are trying to persuade highly reluctant employees to return to the office, but without success so far. And the reluctant are not exactly wrong. Every other country in the world relaxed their restrictions when their infections had gone right down. Alternatively, China, having imposed massively more draconian restrictions than anyone else, is relaxing them when the virus infections are actually at their peak. Largely because the severity of their restrictions triggered the protests, and it became clear people would revolt without too much more encouragement. So, from having boasted to the world that it had the superior approach to handling COVID, China seems to have worked its way into the worst of all worlds, which you may feel is karma for the Chinese government. Xi Jinping has remained silent while his signature policy has rapidly been dismantled across the country. But as always, it's the innocent citizens who suffer the consequences. So far, China's official figures show no recent deaths, but credible eyewitness reports, and really it would be pretty incredible if they didn't, have started to report bodies seen at hospitals. One thing you can guarantee, given the leader's identification with his policy and the Chinese attitude to saving face, the statistics reported from China over the coming months are likely to be worthless. Now you might say, oh, how cynical, Mallen. But only yesterday, the People's Daily, the flagship of the CCP, concluded that Xi's policy had been completely correct all along. The reality has fully proved that our pandemic policy is correct, scientific and effective. It has won the endorsement of the people and can stand the test of history. And it predicted that China would now move from victory to new victory. Which sounds like the sort of thing Vladimir Putin would say, at least if he was saying anything, which currently, right now, he doesn't seem to be. Speculation has been rife as to why Putin has been withdrawing from a number of rather key public commitments. On Thursday, the Kremlin said that Putin would not take to the ice for his traditional ice hockey match in Red Square. And that was just being added to the cancellation of his usually reliable annual press conference, as well as his yearly Conversation with the People Q&A session, that in some years lasted as long as 4 hours. Both of those are normally broadcast live by state television, and they have been key components of his public brand. It also seems likely that he's planning to skip his annual State of the Nation address to the Houses of Parliament. According to the Constitution, the President is required to report in person to Parliament once a year. Now it's being suggested it could be postponed to next year. No explanation being offered. At a time when you would think that the regime would want to project a sense of confidence and stability to an increasingly anxious population, this is not what you would expect. So, of course, that leads to a lot of speculation about whether this means that maybe he's losing his grip politically behind the scenes, or, on the other hand, whether this is related to those long-discussed health problems that he seems to have. Reportedly, and not necessarily related to this short-term issue, the Kremlin has been reported to be preparing safe havens for Putin to flee to should Russia suffer a humiliating defeat. The political analyst Abbas Galiamov said that a Kremlin source had suggested Putin could flee to Argentina or Venezuela if things went seriously pear-shaped. Now that seems to be a contingency rather than an imminent expectation. If you watch my video on how Putin sees the world, you'll recall that contingency planning is what he does, because reacting to setbacks is a big part of Russia's playbook. At least it was when it was at its most successful. Certainly the conversation right now is that Russian forces are gathering strength for a renewed assault against the capital, Kyiv, sending out the message that the ambition to wholly conquer Ukraine has not been abandoned. Ukraine's military chief, General Valery Zaluzhny, said that he thought the attack could come at any point in the first 3 months of next year, most likely in the spring. The mobilisation is bringing, he said, some 200,000 fresh troops. Russian industry has been retooled for the war effort to produce weapons and ammunition. And this could become a big counteroffensive from Donbass in the east, or from the south, or from Belarus. That warning stood in contrast to Western estimates, suggesting that Russia's dwindling stockpile of arms and munitions would seriously hamper their ability to carry out any sort of large-scale offensive operations. It's difficult from a distance to know for sure. Ukraine always, of course, has the incentive to take a pessimistic view of the task ahead, if in so doing it will encourage more support with weapons and ammunition from the West. Or they could just be being realistic about the scale of the challenge ahead. Whatever the contingencies, nobody's expecting Putin to be on a plane to Argentina just yet. And the truth is that even if he got taken out by a health emergency, wouldn't necessarily mean the war stopped the next day. So, come what may, we still have to get through this next bit. If you drew up a list of the things that you want to achieve over the coming years, and you ended up with a list of, let's say, 169, you would have two choices. One is you do some serious prioritising and decide which of those are the ones that you really want to get done. Now that can be a hard thing to do because it involves looking at the things you want to do and consciously deciding you're not going to do them. Or, alternatively, you tell yourself that all 169 are top priorities, so none of them can be dropped, so you're just going to try and do all of them. Now, obviously, that's not going to happen. So way more likely you end up doing very few of them indeed, because you scatter the limited resource of your time across many, and not only do a whole bunch of them drop off the end, but probably more do that than would otherwise have done because you didn't focus your energy on achieving a few. This was the argument I made years ago when the UN Millennium Development Goals gave way to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals had been developed by the world community to focus on some of the big challenges we wanted to solve. There were 8 of them: eradicating extreme poverty and hunger, achieving universal primary education, reducing child mortality, and so on. Generally, big, worthwhile goals. And the world made some real progress. I mean, remarkable progress, really, against most of them, the majority of them. So then people got together to come up with the new round of goals. But of course, large panels of people did what large panels of people always do. They came with their own pet priorities and they refused to compromise. And those broke down into 169 sub-goals with every single thing that somebody wanted to see done. And prioritising became impossible because if you tried, they would point to the harm caused by not achieving that goal and accuse you of therefore not caring about the victims, etc., etc. You know how this game works. Now, I was so critical of this at the time, I recall I ended up being the anti-Sustainable Development Goals side in a debate hosted by CSR Lebanon during happier days for that country. As Jordan Peterson and Bjorn Lomborg pointed out this week in an article, and I know I've been critical recently of statements by both of these gentlemen, but we avoid tribalism by giving credit where it's due, whichever side they place their allegiance to. We are now halfway through the timescale for the SDGs, they pointed out. They have a deadline of 2030. Are we halfway, therefore, to meeting all those goals? Of course not. It was never going to happen because it never could. So Peterson and Lomborg argued for a smaller list of top priorities that should be selected based on the most good that you could do with limited resource. Having made the same argument back at the start, I'm not going to fail to support it now in principle, even though I suspect we wouldn't necessarily agree on what should be on that smaller list. But then that's exactly the conversation we should be having, and the best arguments should win that conversation. Now, none of that's going to happen, of course. The global institutions are incapable of such a thing, at least for the time being. However, that's no reason why you should make the same mistake with your own life. Because we're approaching that period of year when people traditionally think about their life direction. They may come up with New Year resolutions, which are, let's face it, often trivial and quickly broken, but it goes bigger than that. New Year is one of the peak periods for people quitting their job or making other big life changes. Divorce rates go up, so on. I have in recent decades tried to merge the two. I make what you could call resolutions, but it's really identifying my top 3 priority areas for the next year. And then within each of those 3 areas, I identify no more than 3 specific measurable things I can do that will push me in the direction that I want. Now, it can't be more than 3. Whether it's work, family, relationships, health, sport, contributing to your community, whatever, out of a relatively small list of life priorities you might have, you can prioritise 3. It's hard. Then you have to identify what you're going to do in support of those 3 and how you will measure that you've done it. Now, we've seen how people fail to do this all the time. The most common one that I used to see when I worked with high-ranking business executives was that they would always state that their family, particularly their children, were one of their top priorities. But then when you analysed how they actually spent their time, it just wasn't true. I mean, they were frequently home late, leaving early. And that's the point. You express your real priorities by action. If you tell me your top 3 priorities, we should be able to look at the record of how you spent your time and see those priorities reflected in what you actually did. So this is my encouragement now. While you still have a good chunk of time to think about it properly before the new year, don't be the United Nations or the SDGs. Use the holiday season to think about what is most important to you. Then imagine what you have to do to really make that a reality in what you get done. And for the whole of 2023, not just the first half of January. And you can help that by doing a monthly review where you look at what you'd set out for yourself and how you've done so far against it, keep yourself on track, resetting new interim goals and so on. Now, I used to do that pretty effectively. I think the pandemic knocked me off course. 2023 is going to be the year when I re-establish the discipline of it. How about you? All right, my thanks as always to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. I could not get the time to produce these videos without that support. If you would like to add yours, and let me tell you, it really is crucial, that support, to enabling these videos to happen, then please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, we are taxiing down the runway now towards Christmas. Have a great week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.